will hear from this morning. The session is called Imagination and Fantasy, the style in which or by which Maimonides opposes the breaking of theological principles. The first speaker is Gideon Libson, with whom I have long association in multiple ways, including the fact that his father-in-law, Abraham Goldberg, was my teacher, and Gideon has been named the honorary president of the Jewish Law Association recently, and I think that, you know, I'm supposed to really be just a Meturgim on the Amora has told me what to say, but I'm not, so I'm not going to hear that. I have a few things to say. Just as we now know that people like Yaakov Elman have founded a new field in which we must take Persian studies, Zoroastrian studies seriously, and we've even heard quite a bit of that here, even in this session of medievalists mainly. Gideon has founded really a field that goes well beyond any previous studies of the influence of Islamic theology, philosophy, jurisprudence on especially Goenic, but beyond that, because Maimonides is definitely, again, included, we have to mention Maimonides. And so that's a whole field that he's established. It goes well beyond the fact that to list that he's the chair of this, or he holds this chair, or this is where he's been educated. He's simply been involved in educating all of us, and we are very grateful to him, and I'd like to hear his words.
Thank you. Two preliminary remarks. First of all, I'm the last, giving the last paper, so I don't know if they mean by that Acharon Chaviv. I don't know, but Acharon Chaviv Yoter. This is for Dov, so maybe this is the reason why he is the last one. Chaviv Yoter, as Rashi said. Second of all, you know, we spoke yesterday about creation and enable. So Dov created the project, but he enabled us to come here and to enjoy very much this conference. So this is a creation and enable, if you remember from yesterday.
Yes, thank you.
And so I didn't give you, I apologize, I didn't give you handouts, because all my paper is one big handout. You see, I quote from the book of the guide a lot of quotations, and I prefer to do it this way, and hopefully you can follow me without the handouts. Okay, the imagination and its attributes play a central role in Maimonides' thought, especially in the guide of the reflex. Collecting the thousands of passages in that work where he mentions the imagination is the only way to obtain a full picture that indicates its importance for his philosophy. In several ways, Maimonides follows the lead of Farabi and Avicenna, to whom the imaginative faculties and its associated terminology were keys to their philosophical and theological work. He may also have built on a debate against earlier Jewish thinkers, including Immanuel Gavirol and Judah Levi. In the present short talk, however, we will focus exclusively on Maimonides' own take on the imagination, and especially the two terms, Khayal and Wan, which he uses thousands of times to designate the imagination. These terms have been addressed in recent years by Dvorah Black in two works. One, estimation, one in Avicenna, the logical and psychological dimensions, and imagination and estimation, Arabic paradigms in Western transformations. More recently, they were taken up by Sadiq in the meaning of the word on the words fikr and waham in Jado Arabic. I believe that these two designations for the imagination, khayal and waham, are part of an array of 7 terms employed by Maimonides that can be ranked by their closeness or distance from process of intellectual cognition. At one end of the scale is the intellect, akil, with the various terms that fall into its domain. I don't have to give details here. The second is intuition, what we call in Arabic khadas. The third, the power of estimation, qawwa al-shiur. These two reflect a process in which an element of logic links them to the imagination and leads immediately to true and correct conclusions. But they don't involve in any ordinary effort of thought. 4, conjecture, takhmin, which is not part of the philosophical lexicon and in the guide always appears in tandem with khadas. Next, we have the 2 terms of imagination, as I mentioned before, khayal and waham. Finally, at the far end of this continuum, we find illusion, adyan, which Maimonides considered to be wild imagination and describes in various ways, vain and illogical ideas full of fictional accounts that are far removed from truth and wisdom. Quotation, all these are stories that it is not seemingly for a perfect man to listen to, much less to believe, etc. Maimonides applies this designation to those who hold certain beliefs, in particular idolaters and the Sabaeans, or whom attacks viciously, to whom he applies the most derogatory terms, ignoramus on fools, and etc. These 7 terms can be grouped in 2 sets. The first 4 are intellect, khadas, al-shiur, and takhmin. The last 3 of these share some rational element that leads to a logical and reasonable conclusion that brings one nearer to the truth and consequently are acceptable to Maimonides. The second group includes, in addition to illusion, khayal, and waham. Maimonides himself does not classify the 7 terms as he often does in other domains, but I believe that any analysis of the context in which they appear allows us to discern a hierarchy among them. I will not relate today to Maimonides' philosophical view of the imagination, which is a normal faculty, especially in part of the human nature and in the context of prophecy. I will be examining the rhetorical and polemic context, where he rejects and condemns the imagination, except in those situations in which he believes the imagination is essential for the attainment of human perfection or a methodological imperative for educating the masses with their limited power of intellect and understanding. I assert that Maimonides employs khayal and waham as rhetorical and polemical devices rooted in the philosophical argument and applies them as a negative labels to his adversaries, in order to reject their views in matters of faith, theology, philosophy, and ritual that he holds to be groundless and contrary to all logic. I will try to show that his use of these 2 terms, especially waham, generally depends on the extreme nature of the opinion that Maimonides attributes to his opponents and the violence of his rejection thereof. Maimonides frequently contrasts the imagination, which is based mainly on the senses, with the reason and logic, which rest on the abstract thought and leads to the discovery of the truth, and consequently has almost no direct link to the senses. Both species of the imagination, khayal and waham, as well as the various forms of the rational faculty, are the cornerstones of Maimonides' philosophical discourse, He frequently contrasts them as antithetical alternatives. Quote, the action of the imagination is not the action of reason, but its opposite. Another quote. He emphasized the contrast between them in several contexts. Reason distinguished between truth and falsehood, haq and batil, but the imagination rests almost entirely on falsehood and distances one from the truth. So too, with regard to man's attainment of perfection, he says, man advanced towards perfection in ways that pertain to true reality, not imagination. The path to knowledge of God depends on thinking about Him and knowing Him, not on imagination. With regard to one who asserts that the world requires someone who should give preponderance to its existence over its non-existence, he writes, all this follows necessarily if the tense premise is assumed as true, namely thinking about imagination and vain imagination and not about real object and logic. Sometimes, however, he believes that there may be a blurring of the boundaries that leads to confusion between reason and imagination. One individual claims that they are intellectual representations, tasawwarat aqliya, whereas another claims that they are imaginative representation, tasawwarat khayliya. He has in his mind mainly the mutakalimun. I'll come to it later. Maimonides highlights the weakness of those who employ the imagination and the dangers associated with it by means of several demonstrations. The imagination cannot weigh the abstract. It cannot perform the activities performed by reason. The imagination is an evil inclination, and every deficiency of reason or character is due to the action of the imagination or consequent upon its action. The imagination undermines human virtue, but its absence can help repair the virtue and training in the sciences, and interferes with attainment of human perfection. The imagination leads to incongruities that may jeopardize the social fabric of the community and undermine the principles of faith. This leads Maimonides to the conclusion that the exhortation always refer to intellectual appreciations, not to imagination. For thought concerning imaginations is not called knowledge, but that which come into your mind, as he quotes from Gideon. Maimonides warns that men must keep their distance from the imagination even when they have doubts, for lack clear demonstrations of what they are seeking. Maimonides soon attaches the epithet imagination to all his adversaries who hold philosophical and theological views that he believes are imaginary and contrary to reason and logic. The derogatory labels pops up in dozens of passages in the guide. His rejection of those who rely on the imagination applies chiefly to two groups. The first are the champions of the kalam, the mutakalimun. The second are the multitudes who are led by imagination. But other groups too are the target of his work, including those who are governing cities while being the legislator, the soothsayers, the augurs, and the dreamers of the veridical dreams, who have no intellectual ideas whatsoever of wisdom, but only imagination and conjectures. End of quote. With regard to the mutakalimun, one can say in nutshell that with regard to the imagination, he skews them on a trigger. First, they assume that reality corresponds to what they imagine and refer to the imagination as reason. Second, they hold that whatever can be imagined is logically possible. Third, they hold that everything that is imagined exists or can exist. The second group for whom the imagination functions is the Achilles heels are the multitude of the common folk, whom Maimonides often disparages as sees them as a ignoramus, who will believe any made-up tale, and what is imagined by ignorant fools in their evil thoughts. The ascriptions of the imagination to the multitude too cover the gamut of topics, some of them also charged to the account of the mutakalimun, including matters of theology and belief that Maimonides all threaten the foundation of the Torah, idolatry, perverted interpretations of the Torah and prophetic tales, the reasons for the precepts, the occasional assertions that they have no rationale, the acceptance of the plain meaning of the verses that anthropomorphize the deity as the truth about God, which he takes as a metaphor employed by the prophets. The idea that God is a moving spirit of the spheres and stars, and in general all beliefs that are apt to lead to heresy. We can appreciate Maimonides' assault on all those captivated by the imagination from the biblical verse he cites in order to reject his opponents' real reliance on the imagination, and especially, quote, the which come into your mind, from Ezekiel, which indicates that thought about imaginary ideas is not to be accounted knowledge. Maimonides never actually defines Chiyal and Wine, and this lacuna makes it more difficult to find definite key to the use he makes of each term. In both stand for the imagination. If both stand for imagination, why does he need two terms? Is it purely happenstance, a reflection of his rich vocabulary, rhetorical alternatives with no difference in meaning? To put it in another way, are Chiyal and Wine merely synonymous, or are they two different degrees of the disease of imagination that afflicts his opponents? One of them more serious than the other, or not? The fact that in several cases the two words are yoked together in sequence or parallel, or appear interchangeable in the same topics and passages, certainly complicates the matter. Nor have the translator of the guide over the centuries been consistent. For example, I counted no fewer than 12 different Hebrew terms used to represent one. An examination of all the occurrences of the two terms in the guide indicates that there are passages in which Maimonides distinguishes between them and assigns them different degrees, corresponding to the severity of their opponents' divergent or deviant opinion. Sometimes he assigned one an extreme and far-reaching sense, as a level of imagination that is more radical with regard to the complex of theological arguments that contradict his philosophical and theological doctrines. Michael Schwartz perceived the strong negative sense of wine in his stellar Hebrew translation of the guide. He almost consistently rendered Chayal as Dimion, imagination, and wine as a Dimion Shab, false imagination. It does seem to be the case that the uses of wine as a more extreme degree of imagination are more common and prominent than those of Chiyal with regard to his philosophical and theological opponents, the Mutakalimun, the Sabaeans, the multitude, and with regard to those who reject Aristotle's ideas in a way he considered to be unfounded and contrary to human reason. I will not enumerate all of these occurrences today, but offer only a few observations about the distinction between Chayal and Wine. A first example of the distinction, when Maimonides refers to those who imagine that Solomon, the King Solomon, believed in the eternity of the world, he employs the Arabic word Chayal, Yahi. Later, though, he switches to Wine. If I quote, if anyone falsely imagines that Solomon was guilty of this heresy, this is a using of one. Neither Rav Kapach nor prominent translator who in Western languages, Friedlander, Pines, Munk, and others, make such a distinction here. We might then infer that these are two degrees of imagination. The first, which entertains the possibility that Solomon believes the world is eternal, is Yatachayal, is in an imaginary notion that is not totally devoid of possibility. The second, which does posit that Solomon denies the Torah, the truth of the Torah, is much more extreme and indeed false. One. Only at the end of the passage does Maimonides merge the two situations into one and employs the term one. A second example. Sometimes Maimonides attaches negative modifiers to khiyal, deceitful, al-khilayat, al-kazaba, invalid, al-khilayat, al-fasada, groundless, khilayat, la sikha, or presented as a form of imagination that is a false or deceitful invention. Muhtara khadaba, perverse imagination, fasad al-khiyal. All these modifiers may suppose the inference that khiyal itself does not necessarily have a negative sense when not accompanied by derogatory adjective. It seems more likely, however, that the epithets are employed, for example, for emphasis sake only. In one place, Maimonides attaches a negative modifier to one, al-wan kazaba, and it is clear that he almost always gives one an unfavorable sense. The third example, it is only with reference to one that Maimonides expresses on more than one occasion and in vigorous terms his desire to reject or eliminate it. To put an end, quote, to put an end to the fantasies that come to them from the age of infancy, so that the fantasies bound up with those hearts suffering from inveterate disease be put to hand. All these fantasies are rebutted. We can perhaps find support for the proposed distinction between khayal and waham from Maimonides' method of interpreting words according to their context, as he mentions on a number of occasions. I quote, "Interpret in every passage in accordance with the context. You shall thus be saved from great difficulty." Another quote, "We open a gate and draw your attention to such meanings of that particular term as are useful for our purpose, not for the various purposes of whosoever may speak the language of this or that people." Another quote, "No, this is the use of 5 terms to command, to say, to speak, to stand, and so forth, and reflect upon it regarding every passage in the way that fits it." In conclusion, an examination of all appearances of khayal and waham in the guide and their respective contexts suggests that each of the two words has a primary sense and a secondary sense. The primary sense of khayal is that of normal imagination that is part of human nature. In its secondary sense, it sometimes targets those who rely on the imagination and disagree with Maimonides' philosophy and theology. The primary sense of waham is more negative, absurd ideas that run counter to Aristotle or that strike Maimonides as lacking any logical basis, incompatible with the human reason, and liable to destroy the foundation of the Torah or lead to heretical views concerning God. In secondary sense, it comes close to the primary sense of khayal. Finally, a note related to my next book. I have a book that was published on comparative law, but not on this kind of field. I am currently preparing to recently to prepare in few months a book about Maimonides' view of halakha, philosophy, and poetry. I believe that his negative attitude towards the imagination influenced his reserved stance toward poetry. The association between imagination and poetry is inevitable because poetry is an art form rooted in imagination, and imagination is the very core of poetic language. It is through their verses that poets transmit their images to their audience. Some poets, in particular the lesser lights among them, went too far in their descriptions of the deity and allowed their imagination to run rampant about him. But this is really a subject of a separate talk. Thank you.